Hi, everyone. It's lovely to see you all. And thanks to everyone who has already put in the chat where they're joining us from. Keep that coming. It's really nice to see how far and wide everyone is joining us today. I'd like to start with just acknowledging the people of this land that we're coming to you from. We're on Darawal land on the boundary of the Royal National Park. It's a beautiful spot. And we also wanted to acknowledge that there's a very significant date coming up, the 26th of January, the day the colonizers took formal possession of New South Wales. And we'd like to acknowledge that this isn't a day for celebration and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also, just also in the group chat, when you let us know where you're coming from, could you also please just let us know what your interest is with storytelling? That would be useful for us to have a look at as well. Now, to get us started, Doug's going to take us through a poll. Don't worry, it's not legally binding. I can tell you as the lawyer that it won't bind you, but it's just to give you a little flavor of what we're talking about today.
Buenas tardes todos. Gracias por estar con nosotros hoy. Aquí tenemos una encuesta que nos gustaría que ustedes puedan leer y elegir una opción. Tiene dos opciones. Opción A es no me pongo a que mis imágenes se utilicen con fines antes mencionados, o me gustaría que mis imágenes no se utilicen con fines antes mencionados. Le voy a dar unos minutos para responder a esta encuesta. Lo que es importante, si no regresa el consentimiento por esta encuesta, automáticamente vas a dar su consentimiento. Le voy a dar un minuto más porque es muy cortito, entonces debe ser muy fácil para llenar si podemos seguir con este workshop. Entonces, por favor, respóndelo. Tenemos 12 personas hasta ahora. Todavía falta varios más. Le doy un minuto más. ¿Necesita traducción o todo bien? No sé si personas aquí hablan español, así va a ser mucho más fácil, como Gaby que dice todo bien. Ok, 10 segundos, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ok, ya terminamos. Ok, finish the poll.
Well done, everyone.
So, firstly, what we've got here, I'll go through the results and then we can talk through it a little bit. But the people who responded no me pongo, so the first one, so 9 out of 21 people, you've actually given consent for your images to be used in any ways that we choose for our organization and our affiliates or partners. The 12 who said, me gustaría que mis imágenes no se utilicen con fines antes mencionados, basically are saying, I would like my images not to be used. So the people who did the second, so the 12 people who have responded, the second answer have said that they do not give the consent for the images to be used. The 9 said that they're happy for their images to be used. And all the people who didn't respond are also by default giving consent that they're happy for the images to be used. So this is a little test and it's not legal as Jen said. We thought just to break the ice a little bit and just give you a little bit of a taste of what it can feel like with consent forms, and it's something we're going to be talking about in a bit of detail through today, is around consent. So what we might ask you to do now is just to, in the chat, maybe just write around how you might have felt around that or what your experience was with that little exercise. It's something we do with a few people, and I'm not sure how many people understood it. I had one person respond in the chat that was fine. So we've got a few different responses that we might have. So unsure, confusing, confused, not easy to answer, uncomfortable, yeah. We had somebody who speaks a bit of Spanish, that helps. And sometimes what's interesting though is I made the answers quite complex as well. So people probably thought, oh, because the no is there, it's me saying no to it. But I flipped it around to try and make it more complex, which often is the case when we do look at consent forms or complicated legal language, and particularly when it's in a second, third language. Excluded, that's strong. I didn't answer. And I think that's another one that's really common, is we don't answer when we don't understand it and think that might give us the best response. But often when we don't answer, it is the default option in most consent forms is when you go to an event and you don't sign anything, it usually means you've automatically given your consent. So didn't understand, so didn't participate. I didn't respond, I understood, but felt others might not. Pressured, confused. Yeah, really interesting answers. Nervous. But thank you so much for sharing that. Am I in the right meeting? Frustrated. Yeah, so it's quite a few. Yeah, thank you for sharing those answers there. So people sort of understood some of it, isolated, but some really strong emotions. And I think that's really important. We start thinking about the way that we look at how we might have our stories, from photos through to videos and other forms of storytelling, how it can make us feel when we don't understand what we're getting into. And sometimes we might think we know we understand, but afterwards the impact of how that might be used can actually have the impact on us later. And so these are some of the things that we want to be talking through today. And this is that little snapshot just to begin with, to get us started. So what we wanted to sort of begin the session with today, we'll give you a little introduction of ourselves, and then we'll take you through what we're going to go through today. And as Louise said, we're going to start off with, it's going to be more presentation rather than workshop because of the size of the group. And we really wanted to include as many people who are interested in this as possible. And we're more than happy to engage further with you after the workshop. And we also have a Q&A at the end. So at the end of the presentation, we'll have a little break and then come back for whoever would like to ask some questions in relation to this piece of work. So my name is Doug, and I am one of the co-founders of Our Race, and currently studying a PhD looking at storytelling as well. So I have English, Irish, and Japanese heritage, and story has really been something that it's probably been over the last few years where I've got the most interest from it, because of an experience I had when I was working in government with a training program, multiculturalism and anti-racism. And within that, I was asking people mainly people from refugee backgrounds and people from migrant backgrounds to come and share their stories to try and change the attitudes and the behaviours of the staff working within a government agency. And it received a lot of positive feedback. It was evaluated by Australian National University, very, very positive based on people's experiences who attended the workshop. But as I delved into it further, I started looking at, well, what's the impact on the people who share their stories? And started looking at literature, and there wasn't a lot about their experiences of sharing their stories, looking at what the potential impacts could be. And then as part of that, I then met Jen through her previous role with Mark Lawyers, looking at what were the legal implications around people who have their stories shared, where they feel like they haven't provided the consent to that story being shared. Anyway, through that conversation, we realized there's limited scope for the story holders, the community members who get asked to share their stories, limited recourse for them. And so we worked together to develop the framework, which you would have been sent, the principles, and that we'll go through today. And this has kind of been that journey, and it's ongoing. And I feel like always privileged that I can share that knowledge, but also learn from other people in the workshops and the other spaces that we're in. So it'd be great to engage with you further and hear your experiences, because storytelling is something that we continue to learn from. So that's a little bit about me. I'll pass over to Jen to introduce herself.
Thanks, Doug. So my name is Jen Johannesson. I'm Canadian, as you can probably tell from my accent, but I've been here for about 14 years now. My mom's from the Philippines and my dad's from Scotland, and I grew up in a single parent household where my mom instilled in my sister and I from a very young age a sense of equality and work ethic. And seeing her work very hard from a very young age and understanding from then the sacrifice that she made for us really left an impact on me. I came to Australia initially for a bit of an adventure and to study law, and I just never left. And now I have two little Australian boys, and they're definitely Australian because my son will correct me, my 3-year-old son will correct me when I say cantaloupe or cilantro or elevator. So he's a full-fledged Aussie. I've been practicing law for over 10 years and have worked in a top-tier firm as well as a boutique firm, but historically I've been in private practice. But most recently, I've decided that I really want to focus on not-for-profit and purpose-driven work. So that's what I'll be doing going forward. And as Doug said, we've worked together for the past 5 years, a long time.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting for me as a lawyer because I've definitely seen those consents we'll be talking about and also drafted them. That's really the standard practice, is drafting a consent form which requires as little from the story holder as possible, so that you get that consent and then you can do whatever you want with that story. You don't have to go back, all of that. So looking back, looking at it now, I can see that it's really problematic because that leaves very little recourse for the story holders. And it's definitely time that a light is shone on that practice, and that's what we're doing. And it will take some time, but even though contract was part of the problem, I think contract is going to be the solution, at least until there's legislative changes. So that's what we're going to talk to you about today.
Yeah. And so what we'll do is share you a short little animation of our race, of who we are, and then we'll go into the session in more detail.
Everybody has a story. Stories are important. Stories are powerful. Stories hold value. They may be told in private to friends or family, or they may be told in public to an audience. Either way, stories always hold a power dynamic, and when that power dynamic is unbalanced, story holders can be harmed. Organizations can put pressure on story holders and how they tell their story, such as time pressures, entering into agreements and contracts that are not written in the interest of the story holders, and perhaps without the story holders' informed consent. Often, the law and other institutions don't protect story holders either. This can leave the story holders feeling upset, exploited, and overwhelmed. So how can we begin to address the complex ethical issues of storytelling? Our Race. Our Race is made up of diverse story holders, practitioners, and researchers. At Our Race, we work together with story holders to empower them to tell their story their way. We also work with organizations that engage story holders to help them ensure that they're amplifying the story holder's voice. At Our Race, our aim is to flip the pyramid of power to create a story holder-centric model that recognizes and respects the story holders as the experts of their lived experience. So if you're interested in exploring the transformational power of ethical storytelling, come and join us at Our Race, flipping the power together.
Okay. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we developed a framework to try and address this, and a big part around that is around the contracts, but it's also about how we engage. We don't just talk about consent processes and contracts. We talk about, just the consent or the contract. We talk about the processes that we put in place. So what we'll be doing today is we're going through these 5 principles, even though they are all interconnected and you can't really have one without the other, to make it sort of more palatable to understand, we're sort of breaking it up into principle by principle, giving you a few examples and talking through it, both from legal perspective, but also about how we engage. And so when we talk about these 5 principles, we go through the free, prior, and ongoing informed consent. And that fits throughout, as you can imagine, when we start talking about contracts, the resourcing and sensitivity, including payment, but also sensitivity, and people put up there. And I think a lot of people will be talking about the stories that we share with the not-for-profit sector often have a lot of trauma. So how do we engage in sensitive ways around that, and the importance of cultural safety? Empowerment. So looking at how other story holders, and we'll talk about this, we'll use this language and we'll provide some definitions around this very, very shortly around story holders, which is the language we use to talk about the community members who share their stories. The co-design and collaboration. So how do we move to a point where it's actually in collaboration rather than it's only a top-down approach and a story holder only comes in to share the story at the times that we request them to share and the way that we ask them to share. And then the integrity of the story, making sure that they are part of that process throughout, including that editing process. So they're the 5 principles that we'll go into. And as I said, we'll try and break them up one by one, but even the examples that we show, you'll probably see that they address a few different principles at the same time. So the first definition we're going to go into is transformational ethical storytelling, or the acronym TEST, we call it. And it's based on these sort of fundamental pillars around, the first thing is about do no harm, cultural humility, so the importance of cultural humility when we're engaging with people's stories, centering lived experience. So we'll often talk about lived experience should be viewed as expertise. And we believe that lived experience is actually the highest form of expertise. No matter how long somebody studies another group, they'll never become a true expert of that community. You have to live in that community to be that expert. It's a continual journey. So we believe that what we know today isn't necessarily going to be right in the future. We're doing the best with what we can at the moment, and we're open to learning and wanting to learn with others as part of that process. And then the measure of success, I think we really need to start thinking about measuring success. Firstly, what is the impact on the communities that we're working with, not just based on the people who may provide the funding or the audiences that are receiving those stories. What is the success based on the story holders? And so when we talk about tests, we're looking at how do we create safer spaces for story holders so that they're more empowered to create, curate, and control their stories on their own terms, where they had the ownership rights. And so we see this as an anti-oppressive framework. So this aim for us is really trying to get to the point where we really challenge those powers of storytelling, but understanding, like Jen was saying before, that legal structures are there. So how do we work within those structures? And hopefully one day we can actually change legislation around this, but we have to make this the norm. And so we see that the story holder should be able to share their story, and we should respect their rights based on their full self and who they want to be and how they represent themselves. So that's sort of the definition of test. And now Jen's going to go through some of the definitions we'll talk about throughout the session.
That's right. I love a good definition. So it's important to, I guess, just quickly go through each of the terms that we'll be using throughout the presentation, just so you have a firm understanding of what we're talking about when we say each of these things. Story is an obvious one. Story can be anything. As it says here, it's an idea, action, imagination, experience, or combination set of these, which are shared with defined or multiple audiences. Story can be anything from a tweet to a novel. I tell my son a story every single night, and he's pretty bossy, so he tells me what characters he wants in his story, what he wants the story about, where the location's going to be, if it's going to be a happy or sad story. And then he also interrupts me throughout the story when I'm taking it in a direction he doesn't like. So stories are everywhere, and part of all of us. Can share culture. It can have a message. It's a broad definition. Basically, as you can tell, it's everything. The way that you understand a story to be, that's how we're using it as well. A story holder is a person who has the lived experience. So we're all story holders. We all have stories, just as that video indicated at the beginning, we're all story holders. They may choose to share their story or not. But there's also an obligation on the story holder, which actually I think I'll throw to you, Doug, to touch on that a bit more.
So the whole idea when we talk about this, everybody's a story holder, but we also believe there's a responsibility as story holders when we are sharing stories, which may lead to the oppression or removing power of other people. So there is a responsibility of us acknowledging through cultural humility, what is the stories that we're sharing and making sure it might not further oppress others or remove their rights. So that's something also we think about when we're talking about who the story holder is. And our focus has been mainly on people's stories who have traditionally been misrepresented, mistold. And so that's sort of the main space when we're working in that story holder space.
Yeah. Thanks, Doug. And next, we're going to talk about storytellers. So a storyteller may be the story holder, but it also could be an organization or another person who is, as you see here, authorized. We'll put that in quotation marks because we'll talk about that authorization a bit more later, but they're authorized to retell the story. Now, within this definition of storyteller, there's a range of, I guess, how good or bad you can do it, we'll say. And that's the rest of the definitions that we'll go through. The first one, and in our view, the no-no, is the story extractor. This is exactly as it sounds. It's an organization or person who extracts the story from the story holder, takes it, uses it to their own benefit, doesn't consider the story holder whatsoever. They don't give them any creative control or ownership of the story anymore. They've taken it and they're doing it with it what they may, whatever they want. Next on the list, which is more on the middle ground, is a story interpreter. That's a person or organization that tells or creates a story through the lens of the organization. So they're still not prioritizing the story holder, but they're not, as bad as the story extractor. They're not using it for their own benefit. In my view and from my experience, this is where most organizations sit in the story interpreter. They're not trying to be the extractor. They're not trying to just steal a story and use it for their own benefit, but they're still applying that lens. They're still not collaborating. You're still seeing all of those other issues, which we'll get to and talk about more in detail shortly. Next is the gold standard. This is the story partner. This is what the test principle and framework is about. This is the goal. This is an organization or a person who engages a story holder to share their story and commits to the test principles. So they commit to the collaboration and all of the free and informed consent, all of the principles that we'll go through in more detail. This is what the aim is. It's what it's all about.
Yeah, and so this diagram here is just to sort of say what the areas that we work in. So we see that there's two main spaces that the test work fits into. So first from the top left is working with story holders so that they have the knowledge of how stories are traditionally told, but also how they can advocate for themselves. And so sometimes we find that story holders may not want to be the storyteller, or they feel like when they become the storyteller, their story gets extracted or interpreted in a way which they're not comfortable with. And so we do a lot of work around there, working with story holders to provide them the education and the understanding of what it means to advocate for your own story or the community stories. And so some people find that they fit into being that story holder, sometimes story partners, a lot of overlap. Some feel that, like for myself, I feel like I'm more in that story partner space and always working to be more of a story partner. But what we see there is really, we've been running a lot of workshops around with story holders. And we've always said for story holders, they should never have to pay for this because it should be their right to have this information free of charge. And we've also developed a story holder guide, which we've translated into a few languages, 3 languages so far, and a text-only version. And we've got 3 more languages coming up in the next few months. So it's really exciting that we're able to do that. And we've been able to do that all through partnership funding or through our self-funded ways of doing that. And then the other area is like sort of the way that I think this workshop presentations being framed is around the story partners. So those definitions, so trying to move ourselves from that position of the extractors, the interpreters, to become story partners. And it's not just linear like it shows there. There's a lot of different parts, and some things that we can talk about in more detail is looking at that principle by principle. What are some of the things that you're doing? So it can be that review process that you can go through to see whereabouts you're situated as becoming, improving that journey of being a story partner.
All right, we'll touch on some of the common issues with storytelling that we've seen in our experience. And again, this is with the story extractor and story interpreter side of things. The first one there is directed by and or told by those with more power. This is very, very common. And in my experience, it's to the point where often you see it's a big media organization or a charity. They have their standard template document that they get the story holder to sign. The story holder doesn't have any legal representation. There's a huge imbalance of power because you have these big organizations that have a whole suite of legal people working with them versus an individual who then has to understand that document on their own. And of course, I'm always talking about it from the legal side, so feel free to jump in at any point. The second one there is time takes precedence over potential impacts of the story. Again, this is another common one. Everything is on a time frame. There's deadlines drafted into the contract. Even in the contracts where there is a consultation period, usually they'll be drafted into it, a time frame around that. So, we'll consult you, but if you don't come back to us in 2 days, then too bad, you've lost your chance to have a say. So that type of thing. Tight time frames are an issue. Stories used as instruments, commodities. This is also, again, very common, and that's that whole the organization applying the organizational lens over the story for its own purpose. And you see this a lot in charities, where they're obviously trying to get donations. So they may only be showing a snapshot of what that story holder's story actually was. The next one is consultation rather than collaboration. Now, as I said, consultation is already, if you're having consultations, you're already doing better than a lot because often there's not even a consultation. But what we're talking about here is one step further than consultation. It's collaboration. It's ensuring that story holder has a genuine say and has genuine decision-making power over how their story is used. The story is edited without the story holder's input is the next common issue. Again, very common. And again, based on the consent form, the standard is we can edit it, modify it, do whatever we want with it without having to check with you. And then the last one, obligation placed on a story holder. So in addition to story holder not having many rights in the contract, often there's additional obligations placed on them, like you have to meet with this many news media outlets, or you have to have interviews, and you have to do all these additional things that we may ask you to do even after you've shared your story, without any consideration whether or not that person's feeling like they're safe, they want to do that, whether it's re-traumatizing, all of that.
And then I guess with that one is also that sense of obligation. So sometimes going back to the first one with the power dynamics and that sense of obligation, if a manager is asking a staff member to share a story, or somebody's asking a previous client to share a story, even that person may not want to, they might feel that sense of obligation. And we've heard many stories like that particularly from story, like a lot of story holders, a lot from refugee backgrounds in particular, because of there's a real power dynamic there and the expectation to share. So we see that very, very commonly. And Jung, who is the co-founder, she's been in that experience herself, where she's felt obligated to share the story and has felt it to be a very extractive process, but it's taken years to actually realize what had actually occurred. And that's the other part. It's not always that it happens immediately. It can not happen for years later that they realize that these things are in place. Yeah. And we hear this a lot from the story holders. The story holders, when we've run sort of workshops or talked about this, they identify with it very quickly because they've been in that experience, but haven't been able to put the language or the words to it sometimes. So we found that that's been really positive feedback. But then the other side is around the story partners. And I'm going to share an example with you, which I was asked to provide some consulting advice to a media organization who wanted to do some short videos with comedy around some taboo topics. And one of them was around racism. And I received an email from them asking if I could find some people who had experienced racism to share their experiences through this program, which was about going away for a weekend with a white comedian who was going to then use humor to address race. This was, well, 2019, it must have been 2018, 2019, where I was asked about this. And through that email, rather than just responding back to it, I decided to go meet with them in person to find out more information, what they were actually trying to do. At the same time, I was part of a research group called the Challenging Racism Project at Western Sydney University. And they received the same email, and their response back was, we're not going to participate in this. Here is a paper which demonstrates the traumatic issues of people sharing their experiences of racism, and that we advise you not to do this without proper care and attention taken. And when I went to meet with them, there was no proper care and attention. They were just calling up people randomly who they thought they could call and ask for their experiences of racism. And also organizations who just gave them the contact details for them to call people to ask them about their experiences of racism. So the organizations were actually the advocate organizations were actually providing these contact details for people to contact. And it was like a recruitment process. So like asking them about their experiences of racism so they could go on this program or not. Through that, I was saying this process is, you can't do that. Have you got anybody there who's got trauma-informed practice specific to racism who are going to be there? And they're like, oh no, we have a team psychologist, but nothing that was specific around racism, experiences of racism. I said, okay, how are people going to be reimbursed for this? How are people going to be paid? And they said, oh, nobody's going to get paid for it. If people have to take time off work, we can then reimburse them for that time taken off work. But what they do get is they get to have a weekend away where they're going to be in this beautiful house for a weekend for this experience. And I said, what, to share their experiences of racism? And they just didn't get it. And I left that meeting saying, there's a lot needs to be done. I then sent them an email afterwards saying that you need to take all this care and attention if you want to do this properly. The response back was no response. Follow-up email, no response. And then later on, I checked out to see what happened to it. And it got to air. And it was as bad as you'd expect. It was really creating and reinforcing the other and this idea of very white supremacist in the way that they spoke about that. And it was really problematic in how they had done that. And then, of course, the humor part of it as well. It was not doing anything to address racism. It was actually only reinforcing it. And I think even though they might have had good intentions for it, they didn't put the right care and attention into this and really didn't put front and center the communities and the story holders in that. And so this is something trap that we can fall into if we're not looking at this from the beginning all the way through to the end. And this is that sort of standard practice, because what also we see at the end of it, they win awards. So this won an award as a result of that. So it's also thinking about, how do we evaluate the effectiveness of a story? Is it based on the audience, the awards we win, or based on the people who are sharing their stories and the communities who are represented in those stories? So we've got just a couple more sort of issues that, Jen presented 6. I think what we're so used to as well is that whole thing around the individualization of stories. We don't want the community stories where it's that focus of it has to be the individual success story, rather than thinking, well, what is the story that they want to share? And then that focus on the white savior. And we'll show a video around that, which is to really positive change in thought around the humanitarian sector around that. The digestible narratives. So you think about events of the right person or the right parts of the person. Oh, we've got to get the right person with the right story. And that person often gets asked over and over again to share that story because they've got the most sensational story, which gets in the most attention. Most people, yeah, we've got another example about that as well, so I won't share too much. But even the parts of a person where we say, oh, we want you to share this, but not that part of you. Really, that not thinking about the intersectional approach of the stories that we are sharing and the way that we may enforce in some ways of how people are meant to share their stories. The stories essentialize, the idea that one person represents that whole community, and that's what everybody should be aiming for. Oh, the successful refugee. Oh, why aren't everybody else like that? The stereotyping and dehumanizing with that preset narratives that we're so used to a certain type of narrative. So it's like, this is the way it should be fitting. And we do that through a lot of training type programs, telling people, this is the way you need to share your story. And a lot of it is based on what that should look like rather than what is the story that they want to share. And then not providing that safe space, which that is something we always keep on looking at. What does that actually look like? And the most important thing for us to think about is, what does safe space mean for the people that we're working with, ones who are going to be in the positions of vulnerability of sharing those stories.
Okay, I just wanted to quickly touch on, while we were talking about issues with storytelling, the position at law. So as I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention, but I practice in intellectual property and do still. And when it comes to storytelling, the story holder, when you think about how they can be protected by intellectual property, when we say IP, what we're talking about is there's trademark law. So trademark protects the use of a logo or a brand name. There's patent law, which protects innovations and inventions. So obviously those two aren't relevant. And then there's copyright law. So that's really where you'd be looking for protection. But copyright law attaches to the author of the material, not the story holder. So where it attaches to, where it starts protection is when that story is put into a tangible form. So for example, if I told Doug my story and Doug then wrote a book about me, the copyright attaches to Doug because he's the one who put it into tangible form. So unless the story holder is also the storyteller, there's no protection for that story holder from a copyright perspective. So as I said here, when does copyright protection arise? When it's a material form, and it has to be original as well. It doesn't have to be artistic, but it's got to be, it can't be copied. So really the key point here is there's no protection in a story or an idea. It's only in the tangible form in which it's used.
And I guess that goes on to that. We talk about story conditioning a lot, and what leads to story conditioning. So we're so expected to hear and see a particular type of story. We've been conditioned as listeners, viewers, but also as tellers. And so people sort of been put into that position of being so used to having to share that story because traditionally they're the stories that have been told to be the right stories to be told. And so that is through the reinforcing of stereotypes. We're getting better, but we still see that idea of what that person is meant to represent through that sort of stereotyping stories. The repetitive requests, and so many times a lot of the people that we speak to say, oh, it must be NAIDOC week again. Oh, it must be refugee week again. Oh, it must be disability week again. Oh, I'm being asked to share my story because I only get contacted by this organization at particular times of the year. And then I don't hear from them any more times. The advertising and media that we see, of course, reinforces that. And again, it's changing, but it's still a long way to go. The audience expectations, so we're sort of expected to hear a certain type of story. And so we also need to look at how do we educate audiences as well, that it shouldn't just be the same way that we've always used to them. The imbalances of power and ownership. So adding on to what Jen was saying, because of the way the copyright law is written, the ownership then leads to the imbalances of power of the story of who actually owns and controls that story. And then the last one, which I touched on briefly, was the formulaic storytelling training. So when we have that training where it says, this is how you tell your story, and everybody has to retrofit their story into a particular way, can actually reinforce that type of conditioning of what sort of story should be shared. So they're kind of the ones that we talk about conditioning. And now we're going to kind of go into, the principles of why we're addressing these problems that we've sort of talked about here.
Yeah. Another one just to add to this list here, which we'll talk about in the first principle, is that template standard consent. Everyone just uses it. It's just, this is the document that you sign. There's no thought that really goes into it anymore, at least in my experience. And that's that story conditioning, and what we'll get into right now, talking about the first principle. So the first one is free, prior, and ongoing informed consent. So what we're talking about here is story holders should provide their free, prior, and ongoing consent before sharing their stories, so they can make an educated decision about the benefits and risks of doing that. So really, what you want to see before a person's documenting their stories is they need to really understand the purpose for which the story is being recorded and shared, or documented and shared, who's paying for it and who's going to benefit from it, where it's going to be shared, and also for how long. Because, you know, they may be comfortable with sharing it for this purpose, but it could be re-edited and used for other purposes. They need to know all the reasons it's going to be used for, or consulted about that again. They should understand who will own the IP, because again, the standard position is that they won't. And I think that's something that a lot of story holders don't necessarily understand, that they lose ownership of the story once they tell it and sign it away. The relevant timelines and whether or not there's going to be obligations placed on them. Whether they can ask for it to be taken down. So this comes up really often because they may consent to it now, but their circumstances may change where they don't want to be in the public eye anymore, or it's used for a purpose they don't like. Can they revoke their consent? They need to understand whether they can or can't. And whether or not the story holder will have any input into what the finished product will look like. Are they just going to be consulted? Are they going to be consulted at all? Or will they actually have genuine ability to collaborate? So I want to start with looking at a standard consent. And this was from a talent agreement that I think Doug received. Mm-hmm. And this is very, very common. This is pretty traditional. The participant grants extractor and its agents and assigns the irrevocable, exclusive, royalty-free, and unconditional right to use, publish, display, distribute, or alter the content for any purpose, including but not limited to for commercial use or the advertising, promotion, or publicity of extractor and its products and services in any media now or hereafter known worldwide in perpetuity without remuneration. That's a very, very long sentence. And unless you're reading that regularly, your eyes would probably just glaze over, and I would completely understand that, because to be honest, my eyes glaze over too. It's my job to read clauses like this. But there's some really important things in this clause which you wouldn't really pick up on if you were just scanning it quickly, which is what would be usually the case. And here we've highlighted in red. So you're assigning irrevocable, so you can't change your mind. Once you consent, that's it. That's it for life. Exclusive. You can't tell your story to anyone else. You've already told us, that's it. It's ours now. You can't talk to anybody else about this. Royalty free. Even if we make millions of dollars, you're not going to get a cent from it. You're not getting any royalties. And unconditional right. No conditions placed on this. It's ours. To use, publish, display, distribute, or alter the content for any purpose. That goes back to what we're saying. They need to know what purpose. Here, they're saying anything. And we're going to show you an example of where that can go wrong in the next slide, including, but not limited to, the commercial use, so they can make money from it, or the advertising, again, money, or promotion or publicity of extractor and its products and services in any media now or hereafter known, so forevermore, worldwide, in perpetuity, again, forever, without remuneration. So again, no, you're not getting a cent out of this. So this, as I said, is a really, really common consent. And just breaking it down like that, you can see how problematic it is. We can see every single issue we've talked about here in this one very, very long sentence. And also, just before we go to the next slide, where I'm going to show you an example of where it could go wrong, it's worthwhile pointing out that here, this is a talent agreement, but there's a lot of different forms this can take. There's a lot of different places this clause can sit. It can be in an agreement, a consent, a release. You can call it whatever you want. Sometimes it's in an employment agreement, a contractor agreement. It can be hidden in there. So it is an important process when you're aiming to be a story partner, to go through your documentation to see if there's any lingering clauses like this, because they're buried in lots and lots of different documents. That's all, I think, the only point. Is there anything else you wanted to add on that?
I think the only other point probably just to think about is we could have good intentions within the organization that we're working with for, but we often, because when we ask people about, do you understand what's in your contracts and consent forms, most people have no idea, and they go out and share it because their intentions are, I'm not going to do any of these things. But what happens once that's on file, that person leaves the job, who knows what the next person is going to do? So again, it's thinking about our responsibility, like we would with a workplace, we're leaving a role. How do we make sure that the person who comes into the role is not going to manipulate that story in any way? So really thinking about what could be the potential consequences, because it's not that this will happen all the time, but what are the potential consequences and how can we mitigate those through writing contracts which are storyholder centric, and then the processes that we put in place to ensure that happens throughout that storyholder journey.
Yeah, exactly. And let's look at this example of when things go wrong. I think in this situation, the mother of this child saw this image, and this is not what she signed up for. She had signed a template consent years before. It's like 10 years previous.
Years before.
Yeah. And then, walk by this sign. It's like, that's my daughter. Can you imagine? Pretty bad, but according to the consent, that was exactly what she had agreed to when she signed that consent previously.
Because of the irrevocable right and being able to be used for any purposes after, including for the affiliates.
Exactly.
So it could become the stock image, and you think about how stock images are used. And
that's right.
And the way she found it was actually seeing it on the billboard. So when we're running these more as a workshop, we'd be going through these questions and engaging these questions with you in more detail. But for today, because it's more of the presentation, I want you to think about these questions that we'll raise after each principle. So the first one is, how can you ensure story holders are central to consent processes? So we talk about, contracts are really important, but how do we develop those contracts? Who's involved? Who's in the room to develop the contract and consent forms? Who understands what the risk is of what happens when they are the standard consent processes? So it's really thinking about what is the process we take in developing that consent process. And so how do we ensure that story holders are central to that? So I just want you to think about that. You might want to write down a few notes as you go. But that's sort of the first question we want you to start thinking about when we start going through these 5 principles. And that takes us to the second one. And as we said, they're all very connected, and they're actually in the order that you probably really find that they flow a bit as well, because generally speaking, we'd be looking at a contract and we'd be putting in there around the resourcing, which includes the payment, what other resources we have there. And then also thinking about what are the sensitivity measures we're putting in place. We've got sensitivity measures where we're thinking about how we engage people in a respectful way. So, and are we looking at that from before all the way through after, and our ongoing relationship with the story holders we're working with? So what does that mean? What is our responsibility as far as resourcing and sensitivity goes? And that's going to differ depending on the size of the organization, particularly the resourcing. But our standard practice is not to pay people who share their stories. And that can be very problematic. And there are people that might come to the Q&A about what happens when you ask somebody to share their story. and for money? Does that delegitimize the story? I'd argue definitely no, and there's a lot of other people who talk about this in other ways, and there's a film actually that's hasn't come to Australia yet called Subject, and it'll be coming out this year, and we're hoping to do some screenings across the country of that. But they talk about that very issue around the subject or the story holder within documentaries, and how that their stories can actually be changed. But their process around the resourcing is they're looking at how can they make sure people get paid for their time and become co-producers as part of that documentary. So the ones who are sharing those stories. So it becomes more collaborative, which will come in later. But the resourcing, they've really thought about that to make sure that they don't go broke as doing a documentary, but at the same time, how do they make sure if they do get successful through that, that the people who are part of that are also benefiting from it. So it's really thinking about what are the ways that we can actually provide those resourcing in the right ways. But generally speaking, we don't have that. So we're trying to change that. And here's an example, a short audio, which you might sound familiar.
Yes,
right.
how you going, Miss G? Can I just call you Miss J? Yes, Miss J. I don't know who spoke to you last year, but my name is John Smith from Refugees in Need. How you going today? Great. Look, now I wanted to call you because we have our annual Refugee Community Day. And as usual, we want to hear from the community and get some authentic community stories. And someone said that you'd be perfect. Tammy told me that every time you speak, there's not a dry eye left in the room. Your story is just so inspirational, especially those with kids. It's just so heartbreaking but relatable and really helps people to get a better picture of the sorts of journeys that people go through before coming to us. Yeah. So look, it's the same format as usual. You're used to it. Basically, roughly a 10-minute story from you. It's not super strict, but somewhere around there. There'll be a 10-minute question time as well at the end. And then we usually encourage you to stay around it and eat some food if you're able to. That'd be fantastic. As always, we don't have much of a budget, but I'm not supposed to say this, but this year we've got book vouchers for the speakers and special guests. So that's pretty cool. Better than the usual Coles voucher, hey? If that's cool, I'll text you the details after this. Look, you were the first recommendation and you're the first person I called because you're basically a mini celebrity around here and we'd love to continue working with you next year. I've got your email and your number, obviously. So I'll text you information soon, okay? Okay, great. Yep. You have a great day. Yep. I'll see you soon. Okay? Okay. Bye.
Of course, that's not a real one, but it was based on real experiences of people who have received those phone calls. And we've one of my friends, he actually received a call similar to this, and he said, "Oh, I can't do it this year." And I was like, "Oh, where's your gratitude? We've helped you." And that, talk about that sense of obligation, because it was the organization that he'd worked for. He didn't want to share who the organization was. I'll share an article he wrote about that. His name's Rifai Tamas. And he has written an article around that these stories can create more harm than good. And so after this, when the resources that we share, we'll share some additional resources and reading you can do. But he talks about that experience, and it took him a year before he actually published the article because he wrote it in anger to begin with and then revisited a year later, and the same thing kind of happens. And so it is very common, and you probably see it in probably a lot of your work, that type of thing. And so it's that thing of how do we change the way that we look at that? Because it is, as you can see, very one-sided, transactional. And that's what we're trying to look at. How do we address that through that resourcing and sensitivity part, but also the other principles as well. And this sort of takes us on to just this little flow chart of what we see as the common practice. And events are a really common one where we have an event and we see that pre-event where the person gets a phone call like that or an email like this and come and share your story type of thing. And the person, and often there's very limited information. So it's not even transparent. Sometimes a person thinks they're going to be paid. They turn up and realize they're not being paid because of the information they've been shared. And then during the event, what happens if they feel unsafe at that time during the event because they arrive and they realize, oh, the audience is a lot different to what I expected. Should they still share? What are we putting in place so that they actually can say, actually, I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel safe to share. Have we got anything in place to allow for that to happen? And a lot of the time we don't. Is there support people through the event for that person? How do we manage that? Then post-event, is it just a standard email thank you? Or are we doing more than that? And particularly when we talk about people sharing traumatic experiences, it might not come up straight after. But what happens a week later or 2 weeks later when something happens? Is there any support that we're providing as an organization? What is our duty of care, our responsibility there? And then the most important thing is, if it's, these transactional relationships like we hear in that video, we're never really going to build relationships, and we're always going to be at higher risk. So we're going to make sure that we start from that relational way of thinking and working with people in that way. And then it becomes more natural around the storytelling if we've already got the relationships with people, rather than it being that transactional way. So again, that's a thing where we're just trying to look at how do we start to change that, and doing it side by side with the story holders rather than not including them through that process. And you've got this one.
Yeah. And that brings us to the question that we'd like you to consider, which is, how do you appropriately resource story holders' time and expertise? Is it really just thinking about what they're getting out of it? Like, is it just the money factor? Or again, I think it begins with genuine collaboration, and seeing what it is genuinely that the story holder wants out of it, or is getting out of it, of telling their story. But again, going back to the standard consent form, it's usually no money, nothing.
Yeah, and what we're seeing now is a bit of a shift, and we've got a video here we're going to show you. And
oh shoot, sorry.
Wrong way?
Yeah,
Sorry.
wrong way. Anyway, you finish telling
So,
me.
so we've got a video here with from the Médecins Sans Frontières from Norway. So some people might have seen it. Came out late last year, and it's really interesting the way that they're talking about how we've traditionally told stories and how we need to change that. And I've been in conversations with Chinonso, who is the person on your left of screen. So we've been talking to him about this and the work that we're doing and how we can collaborate, because he found the experience to be really, really quite empowering, but he also had to advocate a lot for it. So one of the things he said, I'm happy to take part as long as I don't have to follow the script. I can speak my own voice and have my own words. So that he was able to create the script, what he wanted to say, rather than what he was being told to say. And they agreed with that. So it's a really nice change. And he said, what's happening is it set really high expectations across the humanitarian sector, because it's not just there. All the information, all these other organizations like the International Committee of Red Cross, Save the Children, who have traditionally done these deficit stories and very white savior type stories, are now going, oh, we have to do something about this. So it's a great time to start thinking about how do we do that better. And we'll show this video to give you a little example of a great starting point, I think.
When you picture Doctors Without Borders,
What do you see?
do you picture someone who looks like me?
Helping someone who looks like me.
This is a fundraising poster MSF Norway used in 2006. And we've been using pictures like this for a long time, including pictures of me. The problem is, we haven't always given you the whole picture.
The full picture.
Here, we even cropped out the parents of the boy.
Whose name is Ali Hamad. He's a real person, so that he looks even more alone and helpless.
For years, we've used pictures like this
To raise awareness,
to raise money.
to recruit staff,
But today, we recognize that these images
propagate a single story and perpetuate
racist stereotypes of so-called white saviors.
and powerless victims.
But Doctors Without Borders has always been
Nigerian without borders.
Kenyans without borders.
Filipinos
Without borders.
Haitien sans frontières.
Mexicanas sin fronteras.
Human rights in those countries.
영어는 한국인.
여기가 한국과 미국은 많은 fronteras.
Nepali, pinakunaisimana.
سوريون بلا حدود.
We just haven't focused on them as much as we should have.
So you might not know
That of all our colleagues around the world, the largest number are from South Sudan. You might not know
that this is because 4 out of 5 of our colleagues.
are hired locally in the countries where we work.
You might not know
that today, more than half of our international mobile staff,
of which I am one, come from Africa,
the Middle East,
Asia,
and Latin America.
You might not know that Doctors Without Borders has so much diversity,
because we haven't always shown that to you.
and that is because
Our humanitarian history is unavoidably rooted in the history of colonialism,
and neocolonialism and its stubborn stereotypes
of the white European expert.
and the distant order in need
So now we've begun the long journey to change MSF culture,
and way of communicating and advocating.
and because we all have blind spots, we will certainly stumble along the way.
But this isn't just about getting it done. It's about getting it right.
Some changes should be easier than others.
Like showing a more representative picture of who we really are, and where we are coming from,
When we tell our story.
our whole story.
Of course, that story still includes people who look like me.
Because that is still true.
However, white people shouldn't be the center of every story.
Because that is not the whole story.
And that's why we want to pass the mic,
To our colleagues around the world, much more often.
so that more people from our diverse workforce
And the patients themselves can tell their own story with their own voice, from their own perspectives, and co-own the story. This is important.
So now it's also up to you.
Will you listen to them? We hope you do.
Some say that fewer people will listen when the story isn't told by someone who looks like me.
They say that this kind of poster won't raise as much money. And that means we will save fewer lives.
Will you join us in proving them wrong?
We want to believe you will.
Because this is not about us and them.
It is not about heroes and victims
This is about global solidarity,
and humanitarian justice.
because we are all
just human beings with the same worth and dignity and the same right to live in safety and health.
Yeah, so a few comments in there about it, but yeah, there's a lot of comments about, wow, so good to see something like that, and I think it shows a path forward in many ways, and there are other ones as well, but I think the more that we start looking at it that way, it's going to be really good. I'd also just acknowledge there's been some questions throughout the chat we haven't got to, but we're going to get to them at the end. So I know there's a few there that we'll need to talk to. So we'll get them at the end, and they'll be part of the recording. So who people who have to leave early as well, we'll make sure we can answer as many of those questions as possible. And if you've got questions while you're going through, and you can always put them in now. Louise is collecting them for us, and we'll answer them at the end. Or you can always wait till the end and we can answer them then as well. So yeah, so that's, I think, thinking about the whole 5 principles with that video. But I think when we started looking at it, that whole idea of the co-owning the story, the resourcing and sensitivity, we thought it was a nice places to drop that in and then lead us into the 3rd principle, which is empowerment.
And here what we're talking about is the fact that partners must acknowledge the power imbalance between the organizations and the story holders, and consider how the story holder has genuine decision-making power and authority, and ensure that they feel safe in the way that they're telling their story. From my perspective, again, as I've mentioned when we were talking about the 1st principle, it comes down to having that conversation really early and making sure that they're understanding what they're signing up to in the beginning, with or without a contract. I mean, obviously, I think you need a contract, but even if you didn't have the contract, the whole process is that you still need to go through all of that and make sure everyone's on the same page, make sure they understand what they're signing up to. And it's also worth noting when we're speaking about empowerment, we're talking about organizations seeking to empower the appropriate people who have authority to speak on the relevant subject and ensure that it's the person with the lived experience who's actually talking, and that the organization is not speaking on behalf of the story holder. And just on that point, we have a short video.
Yeah, so it's a short video, I think, really talking about what does that actually look like as in centering lived experience? And I think in this video, the journalist Mohammed Al-Kurd talks about it really well, not just in journalism where he's talking about it specifically, but just in general when we are talking about it in communications or other areas of sharing stories, who should be the one holding the mic?
You know, people, for example,
That's right.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Apologies.
you know, and be like, here with you live, Chad from the Gaza Strip. I don't have that. And I wish, yani, we have... And, you know, I wish, yani, as much I learn and I write about it, but I think the next phase in this is to empower other Palestinians, because we exist across the stretches of desperate geographies, of desperate legal statuses. We are facing this dispossession differently. If you're not getting demolished, you're getting bombed. If you're not getting bombed, you're getting evicted. If you're not getting evicted, your residency is getting revoked. And you need people who are able to narrate that with authority. And yes, it's wonderful that I'm in the public eye, I'm in the spotlight, but it would be even more powerful if organizations, media organizations, were able to make structural changes to implement Palestinians who have the authority to speak about certain things. And when I mean like implement Palestinians, I don't mean hiring an intern to grab you coffee, but correspondence.
In my defense, I started off as an...
So we'll just stop it there. So it's just, here's like, the whole interview is incredible, but really that point, and we talk about authority to tell the story. And he's even gone to the point that he can't speak on behalf of all Palestinians. And I think we see similar things here where people are requested, say, First Nations people to speak on behalf of all First Nations people, rather than speaking just on their own perspective and even their own people and own country. So how do we ensure that we are putting structural changes to implement that, where it's not just the tokenistic, as you said, to get the coffee or to have a particular role? What are the opportunities within our organization so that we are having the lived experience at the center?
Yeah. And here,
You might need to do...
Here on this slide, this is the opposite of empowerment. Organization directs the entire project. Organization sets terms of engagement, regular story washing, story holders viewed as commodities, lack of transparency. So here, it's each of these points that really needs to be addressed to achieve that empowerment.
And I think we use story washing a lot because we see it, whether it be greenwashing, rainbow washing, but the way that stories are being used to hide the work of the other things that they're doing. And I think these next few slides show that very, very well.
Exactly. Speaking of rainbow washing. So we have here, join the growing list of corporate Australia supporting marriage equality. And then, you know, you have it up there with their logos, no further detail beyond that. But then when you look deeper.
And this is the US context as well. So this is, so the first one's Australia. So we're not looking in detail there, but we know that there's similar sort of things, and asking that question around, is corporate activism, or is it a form of their own interest being served to do that? And this is something that was called out in the US around similar processes there. And you can see on the right is the various organizations who do something like the one on the left, where they've celebrate Pride Month, but then as you see, what they're doing is as they're doing the celebratory type of thing, when it comes down to the money, they're investing it in anti-LGBTQ politicians. You see that in many aspects as well around what does the actual organization represent. And it's that question that we sort of ask, is it really empowering, or is it just performative?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's it serving?
Yeah, who is it serving?
Exactly.
And talk like the refugee space is rife with this. And this friend of ours, Mustafa Ali, who is a photographer, runs a charity and has just done a lot of work in this space. And I think his words here are just really important for us to think about. You know, refugees are mostly considered and presented as numbers and even financial opportunities for companies. Their agency capabilities and emotions are overlooked. So sooner or later, the world has to hear refugees' voices as stakeholders and work with them, which again is back to that point around collaboration and centering their experiences as the experts in this space.
That's right. So let's do our question.
Yeah, which is the third question. So how do we ensure that story holders have decision-making power from the beginning all the way throughout? And that can mean structural changes within the organization. What does the leadership of our team look like? What does the board look like? Is that representative of who we are there to work for, to support, why our organizations exist? Because it has to be around how do we start to shift those power dynamics?
Yeah.
And it nicely leads on to the fourth principle is around the co-design and collaboration. And so when we talk about that co-design and collaboration, we're saying consultation is better than what happens a lot of the time. A lot of the times consultation is tokenistic. It doesn't actually really happen. And so we believe we should be aiming for something higher, which is co-design collaboration from the beginning. When we start thinking about the story, making sure the story holders are part of that design process, not just asked in at the end. And we've got a humorous video here to talk about that, which often happens in the First Nations space. And our colleague Colin is actually in this video, and might get a little bit of a laugh from it as well.
Now, before we get started today, I would like to introduce everybody to Ron Carter. Now, don't be scared because he's a white fella. Kevin. He works in the city as part of the cultural development team. Oh. So let's say a good welcome to Ron.
Hey. Thanks, Katie. I look forward to working with everyone.
Great. Well, Arnie Pam has had so many great ideas, like market stores and a jazz concert featuring Ursula Jovovich. Oh! Yes! She got a lovely voice, that one.
Yeah, I don't know. Just feels a bit gammon, don't you think? Traditional food and music is much better than bongos and churro sticks.
Yeah, well, it'll be a mixture of local and international acts, yeah.
I hear what you're saying, but our advantage here is I'm the Migaloo Mulliga.
Oh, God.
I can see what non-Indigenous people are expecting. And believe me, it's not a jazz band. People want to see Gurrumal. Why can't we get Gurrumal?
Well,
I get it. We're trying to break stereotypes. But let me break it down from the Gubba perspective.
Is this motherfucker mansplaining?
If you're offering up jazz and tapas, people may as well come to some Wodjila market. Trust me, people want the blackfella experience. So embrace it.
hold up. This isn't for white mob. This is for our mob. Just because you get us, don't mean you can talk to us like shit.
No, I don't mean it like that at all. I just think we can do so much better. Look, I voted Greens. I don't celebrate Australia Day. I mean, I listen to the Hot 100, but I'm coming at this from a place of best intentions.
Yeah, well, the stolen generation was done in best intentions, and look where that got us, you big mission manager.
You should be grateful for this opportunity. Namaste.
So, yeah, as you can see, humorous, but very, very true that we see often in that, and often humor, comedy is right at the edge of those types of things. And that was from a few years ago, as you can tell by some of the comments in there, but it's something that we have to look at. And when we start thinking about what does co-design look like, consultation look like, and I think that consultation piece is really common, that we kind of see consultation being very top down, and who's included and excluded through that consultation process, who makes that choice, and sometimes can be very deliberate of who might be excluded from that. And this is kind of like what we would see from that consultation process, which is not real consultation, very much consultant type work, can be where the organization holds that position as the expert. So the story holders aren't included. If the external consultant often comes in, they're not speaking to the story holders and community members, it's leadership. The story holders are commodified to achieve the project goals. So about that commodification, the means to an end sort of thing. Sometimes it's the organization who just wants the story holder to sign it off. So when we think about consultation projects, sometimes it will be, we've engaged with all these organizations, but actually not included anything that they said. But it looks like they have because of the level of engagement based on numbers. And the story holder consultation, just for credibility purposes. Oh, we've reached all these organizations across all these different sectors, so this must be a credible source. And that the story holders' time and ideas are not valued, often not paid for it, and not even listened to and included, as I said before, tick and flick sort of exercise. And there's just one small example we've got here from a tweet around that consultation, and it's from Dr. Tracy Westerman, who has been working in this space around, as you can see, 2 decades working to reduce the burden of mental ill health and suicide in Aboriginal communities. And then you see the tweet on the left, there's this strategy that extensive consultations were held, but nobody in her office has actually even heard about it. So what does that actually mean? Who is chosen to be included and excluded from these? So really thinking about what does that consultation look like compared to collaboration? Because if it was through a collaborative process and we're speaking to the right people, would we be including the right people as part of that so that people like Tracy and her team were not excluded from it?
Which leads to our last question, is how do you shift from the consultation approach to a collaborative model? What changes do need to take place in the organization for that to happen? What processes do you need to implement? At what level, as Doug was saying, do changes need to be made? And the answer could be varied and definitely worth a deeper dive.
Yeah, no, that's it. Yeah.
So now we're on to the last principle, number 5, the integrity of the story. And what we're talking about here is, as I mentioned, stories often have been dramatically changed from their original form or used for a purpose that wasn't originally intended. An organization that's a partner must maintain the moral and cultural integrity of the story by not adapting it or changing it without informed consent. And again, as I've mentioned previously, if that story is going to be used for a purpose other than what was originally contemplated, then there needs to be further collaboration undertaken. And one common way this comes up is erasure, which we'll look at an example here.
So you might have seen this before and recognized a lot of the people within this photo. So this was a few years ago where it was a climate summit, youth climate summit, somewhere in Europe. And you could see the same photo, but being edited. And on the right hand, you see the original, and the left hand, Vanessa Nakati, who's a climate activist from Uganda, has been cut out. And when she saw this image, she recorded herself on Twitter about a 7-minute audio. And I've just got a fraction of what she said in that video, where she was in tears saying this. And she said, "This is the first time in my life that I understood the definition of racism. Does that mean I have no value as an African activist, or the people from Africa have nobody at all?" And it's such, thinking about like her saying that, and also Africa is the continent that is probably most affected by climate change and the least it contributes to climate emissions, that erasure, not only in the way that we talk about climate justice, but also through the stories we tell from a photo like this, where she's been erased very easily as well. And so this is an example of what we can see when editing processes and the integrity of the story is not maintained.
That's right. And then each of these points here, organization owns the copyright and IP, editing and interpretation limits or exclude story holders, integrity of stories compromised, Organization owns all creative control and usage. Organization creates a library for repurposing. If we go back to that initial consent that we chatted through, the long sentence, it includes each of these, and it's each of these points that really need to be considered in each situation. Because it may not be that the it's appropriate for the story holder to own the IP in certain situations, but that's something that needs to be ticked off and understood by the story holder.
Yeah, and I think with that repurposing, we're so used to that idea of capture as many photos as you can, put them in the library so we can use them for later purposes.
Exactly.
And so that's something we need to look at is that the best way for us to do it? How do we change that when we need that image, the stock, that image for the next one? So it is going to be a process. And that's when we talk about these 5 principles need to be implemented at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And as much as I bang on about the contracts, it is the contracts, but it's also the process. It's the process that needs to happen first, and then the contracts that then reflect that change.
And so this is the last question that we'll raise. So how do you ensure that story integrity is maintained? So as we said, contracts and those processes that we go through to ensure that it is from the beginning through to the end. And so we showed quite a few bad examples to show you what can happen. Now I've got a couple of good examples that we want to show you. We had one good example, a couple more good examples. And the first one here, we'll share the link with you, but because this is an interactive storytelling experience. And it's called My Grandmother's Lingo. And it's really powerful way of storytelling where it is very collaborative and time is being considered, consent is being implemented. And it started off from this woman, Angelina, whose grandmother had just passed away. And she was one of the last speakers of the Mada language. And so she wanted to revitalize that language and learn the language. And she met someone, an SBS producer, and they worked together on how they could work on this program. And they took their time in developing it, ensuring that they were engaging with the elders in a respectful way, making sure they were capturing their voices in a sensitive way as well. And they were also thinking about what was their purpose, and their purposes were aligned. And so when you have your purpose aligned with the story holder, story partner, it's a really easy process because you engage back and forth. It's this ongoing consent process. And you start thinking about, well, what is it we want to achieve from this? And what they both found was it, and also the people who were involved in the project. So they ended up having a First Nations from a different country, like as in on this land, so-called Australia. But he did the animation for it, and they had all these other people as part of that process as well, to making sure the right people were included and part of designing this program. And it ended up being shared in schools, and even people in Canada, First Nations people in Canada saw and go, wow, this is amazing, we want to learn from it. So they started sharing this knowledge of this program, of this way of working to do something similar. And so we see that it had that First Nations perspective and the story holder specific, as in the elders and Angelina throughout that process. The story partner was working with her to reach those same goals. And that story's been maintained throughout. And it's become an educational resource in many schools in Australia and around the world. So it's really, really powerful what can happen when you do work together. So we'll share the link with you so you can have a play around with it, because it is an interactive one. It's called My Grandmother's Lingo. If you want to type that into your search, you'll find it.
It's really cool.
It's really cool. Yeah, and you get to use the language at the same time. And then the next one here we're going to show you is one from Kenya. And I'll just read you a quick excerpt and then show you it. So it says, I was paused there. All right, so this one I was going to quickly read what they said was, this was just in time for International Women's Day. It's time to get schooled on the art of netball. Mama Hope, which is the organization who did the video, believes that everyone should have a say in how they're represented. When asked what they would make a film about, the women of Nyamonji neighborhood of Chiga village in Kisumu, Kenya said, netball. We always see African women as sad and poor. We want to make a video about something we love. These women are multi-dimensional. Some own small businesses, some farm, sell dried fish, make bread, sell fabric and scarves, sing for a living. All of them are mothers and most are caregivers for orphans in their own home. There are leaders of water committees and microfinance groups. They also carry water on their heads for miles, live in one-room homes with mud-packed walls, and worry about paying their children's school fees. Their ability is infinite and inspiring. Amongst all this is practice 4 times a week and at times walking over 4 miles for tournaments. These ladies don't mess around.
We love netball. You don't know netball? There are 7 players. 60 minutes. We have 3 seconds to pass. 3 seconds. The ball goes through the loop. One team wins. Only one. One loses. We play to win. Victory is an excellent reason to sing and dance. Men don't play netball. Men just jump like goats. They can't handle it. They are too serious. They can't take abuse from the women. They complain. It's about community. It's about friendship. Netball is for women, mothers, and daughters. I'm a mother and a hustler. A wife and a netballer. A mother and a netballer. A player and a joker. Who run the world? Girls. 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 Who run the world? Girl.
So just a nice one sort of for us to finish off. And now we're just going to go into what we sort of see what some of the next steps can be for you to think about and what you can sort of take away from today.
So number 1, review and update your consent processes, ensuring story holders are empowered to advocate for their stories. Number 2, review and update your storytelling programs, asking key questions of who and what is included and excluded. 3, review and update your storytelling and community engagement practices. 4, review and update your community consultation process to make sure it's collaborative. And 5, review and update your curation process to always respect story holders' lived experience. So it is a journey. It's definitely a journey. Some things are easier to tick off than others. Like I said, reviewing your consent processes is fairly easy. You can just do that, but it's really the processes that underlie that that's going to be where the bulk of the work lies.
Yeah, and I think there's opportunities for you looking at that, just even looking at it today or tomorrow and having a look what is in that consent form, because we've sort of shared what could be some bad practices. And don't be surprised if it's quite similar to the one we shared in lots of ways, because if you haven't looked at it for a while, that, as Jen said, it's very standard. And the one that we've shared there in that first example is from a university who you would think be able to do a lot better than that, because like you go through ethics processes with universities, which is meant to ensure that we're protecting the communities that we capture the stories from. So what we've got here is, we're saying it's a journey. So what we've developed as part of this framework, and we're happy to share that with you. One part is we've had organizations and individuals sign the commitment, which we'll share around with you after this as well. And really, it's just a commitment to say that you commit to going on the journey to implement these principles and to do it better. And that's our whole purpose, is how can we do it better? So you can choose to that. There might be things that you go, oh, we're not ready to sign it because of organizational or whatever it is. Doesn't mean you don't have to do it. So we've worked with organizations who have signed the commitment and are starting to do the work themselves, while other organizations, particularly the big ones, they haven't signed the commitment, but we have a big investment from within the organization from some senior leadership staff who see it's really important, but they don't want to be tied down to that right now. So it really depends on where you're at. But we see that journey is like, there's part here, which is that knowledge development. And so it includes story holder workshops, the ones we hold with story holders, the story partner workshops, this has been more the presentation. We'd go deeper into it with a team or an organization so we can start addressing those questions. We believe both of them are necessary for story holders and story partners. And that's what we sort of aim for. The gold standard is the story holders have a slightly different training to the story partners. We can combine them as well. It just depends on how we go about that. And then we also look at this organization review and evaluation. So we can look at that with you, go on that journey. And the way that we work, we can come in and come out as need be. So we really see that as we want you to do the work. We're there to sort of work with you because we believe if you're doing the work, you'll understand it better. The organization understands it better, and then you'll be able to implement it better. And then that implementation includes things like the contracts, policies, and processes you put in place. So how are you developing the contracts, policies, and processes? We can assist with that, but you might also have your own legal team or others who you work with, but it's something that we've been working on for quite a while, so happy to support in that. Then we look at this story holder centered design. So we want to make sure that story holders are part of that process throughout. So with some of the organizations we've worked with, we're saying, yes, senior leadership is great to talk to, but we really need the story holders' experiences with the organization to really understand what's working, what's not working. If we don't do that, then we're just creating the same issues as always. And then sometimes we find it can be quite overwhelming. So we look at a project pilot. Is there a particular space that you want to work in? Is it an event that you're about to run? Is it a communications project, or is it a research project or a community engagement framework? Whatever it is, but starting off with something, you go, oh, this is where we're ready to start with. And that's sort of like a good starting point. And then that's a learning experience to see how you then implement it further across the organization. And then the last step is around certification that we're working on at the moment, which would include an audit that we can audit the organization to then look at providing test certification. And then there'd be a review process as part of that. Every 12 months to 2 years, we'd be looking at how that review process would be. But as I said, it's a journey. So we don't expect everything to be done straight away. We want to see progress. And there'll be some things that we really need to see in place. So make sure that story holders are always centered. And that's it. So we have a last slide just with the contact details and a quote. There it is. And this is from one of our facilitators and workers with us who started off at a workshop. He was actually a participant in a workshop and just connected to it. And since then, he's become part of the team. And as he said, I'm not used to studying the subject as I'm always seen to be the subject. But by participating in workshops, I feel more confident to navigate this space and control my own narrative and tell my story my way. And what's super cool is with the people that we've been working with or have attended workshops, this has been something that's happened, and we're looking at always expanding that network so that the workshops, particularly the story holder workshops, can be led by those people with lived experiences, because we really believe that lived experience has to be valued as that expertise.